I'm not proud of how fast my brain went there, but the moment I saw him slide into that closed room at the office party, my stomach dropped like I just missed a step on stairs. Because it wasn't a bathroom. It wasn't a storage closet. It was one of those rooms everyone pretends not to notice. No sign, no keycard reader you can casually joke about, and a door that's always shut like it's part of the wall. The kind of place you only learn about if your job puts you near the building's boring, sensitive guts. And my coworker, he had no reason to be anywhere near it. The worst part is how normal everything looked around him. Music too loud, cheap holiday lights taped to the ceiling tiles, people laughing a little harder than they meant to because there was an open bar and a year's worth of stress in the air. Someone from sales was doing karaoke like it was their last night on Earth. HR had already made a speech about safe choices that everyone nodded through. The CEO had done the quick, thank you for your hard work drive-by. It was the most predictable kind of corporate fun. And then I saw him. Let me back up a little. I'm a guy in my early 30s, not management, not an executive, not someone with power to throw around. I'm the person who gets called when something breaks, when a report looks wrong, when a system needs to be cleaned up before it turns into a public embarrassment. I don't have access to everything, but I have enough access that people assume I'm techie and stop asking questions. That's basically my brand. Quiet, useful, not dangerous. He was the opposite. Let's call him Derek. Derek was charming in that polished, low-effort way some people have. He remembered names, showed up to birthdays with cupcakes, offered to help new hires settle in. He also had this talent for being around when things went well and disappearing when they didn't. Nobody hated him. That was the point. When someone is universally fine, nobody looks closely. We'd been working together for about 9 months. Same floor, different teams, but enough overlap that I'd seen his patterns. He liked to talk like he was in the know. He'd stand by the coffee machine and casually mention things that hadn't been announced yet. He'd drop hints like, I'm not supposed to say anything, but... And people leaned in because it made them feel chosen. He never crossed a line that you could write up. He just lived on the edge of one. So when I saw him at the party, I didn't think much. I nodded, he raised his drink in that, we're all in the same boat way, and I moved on. The party was on our floor, but half the building was still accessible because facilities didn't bother locking everything down. Most doors were on badge access, but during events, they'd prop some open to keep people from bottlenecking. It was messy, casual, and I remember thinking, this is exactly the kind of night where something small becomes a problem on Monday. Around 10:20 p.m., I stepped away from the crowd because I needed air. Not outside, just away from the noise. I walked down the hallway toward the quieter side of the floor where the conference rooms were. The lights were dimmed, the carpet swallowed footsteps. The music was a muffled thump behind me. That's when I saw Derek again. He wasn't drunk, his posture was steady. His eyes were too focused for someone just looking for a bathroom. He was moving with purpose, but not so much purpose that it looked suspicious. He had a plastic cup in one hand and his phone in the other, like he was just checking a message. He glanced over his shoulder once, quick. Not a casual glance, a check. Then he turned into the short corridor that led to the closed room. I slowed down without thinking. I wasn't trying to sneak. I just didn't want him to notice me noticing. I stayed back by the glass wall of a conference room and watched him stop in front of the door. He didn't hesitate like someone trying the wrong door. He didn't look confused. He tapped the handle first like he already knew what he was about to do. The door didn't swing open. It shouldn't have. It was locked. And for half a second I relaxed, because the simple explanation would have been, okay, he was curious. He tried it, didn't work, end of story. But then he shifted his body slightly, like he was blocking the view of his hands, and leaned in close to the doorframe. And the door opened. Not all the way. Just enough for him to slip through sideways. It was smooth and practiced. He didn't fumble. He didn't panic. He didn't laugh like he just pulled off a dumb party trick. He stepped inside and pulled it shut behind him. The hallway went quiet in a way that made every little sound feel loud. My breathing, the distant bass, the hum of HVAC. I stood there with my mouth half open like an idiot, staring at a door that, in my head, had always been a hard boundary. My first instinct was to walk up and yank it open. My second instinct was, don't do anything stupid at a work event with alcohol involved, because that's how you become the story. I've seen careers die over less, so I did the most boring, controlled thing I could think of. I looked at my phone and noted the time. 10:21 p.m. Then I watched the hallway. I waited for him to come back out with that smug grin people get when they've done something they weren't supposed to. I waited for some alarm to go off. I waited for a facilities guy to show up annoyed and confused. Nothing happened. 2 minutes passed, then 5. The party noise behind me swelled as someone started clapping to a song I couldn't place. I could have walked away and told myself it was nothing. I could have convinced myself that maybe he had permission. Maybe he was grabbing something for someone. Maybe it was a janitor's closet and I'd built it up in my head. But I couldn't shake the way he checked over his shoulder or the way he moved like he'd done it before. At 10:28, the door opened again. Derek stepped out like he'd just come from a meeting, not a locked room. He adjusted his shirt cuff, glanced down the hall, and then, this is the detail that stuck in my throat, he smiled to himself. Not a party smile, a private one. He walked back toward the noise, and as he passed me, he didn't even look surprised to see me there. He just gave me a nod like we'd shared a harmless secret. "Long line for the bathroom," he said, casual. I stared at him for half a second too long, then forced a laugh that didn't sound like me. "Yeah," I said, something like that. He patted my shoulder like we were friends and disappeared into the crowd. I stayed in that hallway a moment longer, listening to the muffled music, feeling stupid for caring and worse, feeling like if I didn't care, that would say something about me. So I opened my notes app again and typed one more thing under the time. Derek. Closed room. Smiled on the way out. I told myself I'd forget about it. That's what I always do when something feels off at work but doesn't come with a flashing red light attached. You shelve it. You assume there's a reasonable explanation. You don't go looking for problems that don't have your name on them. For about 48 hours, that plan worked. Monday morning was normal in the way Mondays usually are. Too many emails, too much coffee, people pretending the party hadn't happened. Derek was already at his desk when I came in, joking with someone from finance, perfectly relaxed. No hangover, no nerves. If anything, he looked lighter. Around 10, my manager pinged me about an issue with a shared project repository. Nothing dramatic. A permissions mismatch. Files that should have been visible to one team weren't, and another team swore they hadn't touched anything. It was the kind of thing that lands on my plate because I'm good at untangling boring messes. I pulled the logs. At first, it looked like a standard misconfiguration. Time-stamped changes, user IDs, system acknowledgements. Then I noticed a pattern that didn't quite sit right. The changes hadn't happened during business hours. They'd happened late, after hours late, and not just once. I scrolled back. Same user ID, different dates. Same window of time, between 10 p.m. and midnight. Always subtle changes, nothing loud enough to trigger alerts, just enough to create confusion the next day, enough to make someone else look careless. That was when the irritation started creeping in. Not anger, not yet. Just that grinding feeling of unfairness when you realize someone's been playing a game you didn't agree to. I checked the user ID more closely. It was a shared service credential, one of those legacy access points that exists, because ripping it out would break 3 other systems and nobody wants to own that risk. Officially, only 2 teams should have been able to use it. My team and infrastructure. Derek wasn't on either. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the ceiling longer than necessary. There were still innocent explanations. Maybe someone had used his machine. Maybe credentials had been cached somewhere they shouldn't have been. I didn't want this to be a thing. Then my inbox pinged again. This time, It was an HR calendar invite. Clarification meeting. One of my coworkers, Emily Sharp, quiet, no drama, had been called in to explain why a deadline had slipped. A deadline I knew she'd hit. A deadline that only slipped on paper because of the permissions issue I was staring at. I walked past her desk on the way to the kitchen. She was chewing on her lip, staring at her screen like it might say something different, if she looked hard enough. "Hey," I said casually. "You good?" She forced a smile that didn't convince either of us. "Apparently not." I didn't push. You don't dump half-formed suspicions on someone who's already under pressure. But something clicked into place right then. Not proof, not certainty, just a shape. This wasn't random. By Wednesday, it happened again. Another small disruption. Another person quietly blamed. Another after-hours change in the system that shouldn't have happened. Derek floated through it all, offering help, nodding sympathetically, being visible in all the right ways. And then there was the closed room. I tried not to think about it, but the memory kept resurfacing. The way he moved, the way he smiled. That room wasn't just restricted. It housed part of our internal access infrastructure. Physical interfaces tied to logical permissions. Most people didn't even know that connection existed, let alone how to use it. I checked what I was allowed to check. I stayed firmly on the right side of policy. No hacking, no snooping. Just documented access, standard audit trails, and logs I had legitimate reasons to review. That was when I saw it. A single log entry from the night of the party. Buried deep enough that you'd miss it if you weren't looking for anomalies. Door access registered. No alarm, no error. Just a clean acknowledgement from a system that rarely gets touched. Time, 10:22 p.m. Duration, 6 minutes. Associated device. One I recognized. It wasn't conclusive on its own, but paired with the other logs, with the timing, with the fallout, it was enough to make my pulse pick up. But that was just the beginning, because once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. I started noticing how Derek positioned himself in meetings, how he always knew which issues were about to surface, how he'd gently steer conversations so blame drifted toward people who weren't in the room. And I started noticing something else too. People were scared, not openly, not dramatically, just enough hesitation before speaking, just enough deflection, like they'd learned instinctively that certain lines of questioning came with consequences. I tested the water with someone I trusted, Mark from infrastructure. I didn't accuse. I didn't even name Derek. I just asked, hypothetically, whether anyone outside the approved teams could have had physical access to the control interfaces. Mark frowned. In theory, no. In practice, he hesitated. If someone knew what they were doing and when to show up, maybe. Would it leave a trace? Everything leaves a trace, he said, then quieter. The trick is knowing where to look. That night, I stayed late. Not to act, just to think. I realized something uncomfortable then. If I pushed too hard, too fast, I'd become the problem. If I stayed silent, more people would get burned. And Derek? Derek was counting on that balance, on everyone choosing safety over clarity. That was the moment I stopped seeing him as a coworker who'd crossed a line, and started seeing him as someone who'd built a system that protected him. And systems don't collapse because of outrage. They collapse because someone documents them properly. By Thursday, I wasn't sleeping well. Not because I was scared of Derek exactly, but because every time I closed my eyes, my brain kept replaying small moments I'd ignored over the past year. Comments that felt harmless at the time. Decisions that didn't quite add up. People quietly transferring teams or burning out without a clear reason. It all started lining up in a way that made coincidence feel lazy. I tried the most rational thing first, asking questions that didn't sound like questions. In a project sync, I asked how permissions were being managed lately. In another meeting, I asked whether after-hours changes were being tracked differently since the last audit. Neutral tone, curious, not accusatory. The room responses were careful. People answered, but not fully. Eyes flicked to calendars. Someone joked about process debt. Another person said, "We can take that offline." No one contradicted me, but no one leaned in either. It was like pushing against something soft that refused to move. Later that day, Emily stopped by my desk. She didn't sit. She just stood there with her arms crossed, staring at a spot past my monitor. "HR cleared me," she said. "Sort of." "Sort of?" "They said it was a miscommunication and that no one was at fault." She exhaled, which somehow feels worse. I nodded. "Did they explain the permission issue?" Her laugh was short and sharp. "They said it was being looked into." Then she hesitated. "Can I ask you something? Off the record?" "Always." She lowered her voice. "Have you ever felt like someone knows what you're about to say before you say it?" The question hit harder than it should have. "I have," I said carefully. She nodded once. "Okay, that's all I needed." Then she walked away. That night, I stopped being the hero. Up until then, some stupid part of me thought I could resolve this quietly. That if I gathered enough context, nudged the right person, or framed it the right way, the whole thing would deflate without collateral damage. That nobody else would have to feel exposed or embarrassed. But Derek wasn't sloppy. He wasn't impulsive. He was patient. And patience beats good intentions every time. So I changed how I worked. I stopped talking and started documenting. I built a timeline. Not dramatic, not emotional. Just dates, times, systems, and outcomes. Who lost access, who got questioned, what changed afterward. I cross-referenced logs I was already allowed to see with publicly available meeting records and ticket histories. Everything stayed within policy. Everything had a reason to be open on my screen. And the picture sharpened. The closed room access wasn't frequent. That was intentional. It was just often enough to refresh credentials, check interfaces, and leave without triggering reviews. The after-hours changes followed within days. The fallout always landed on someone who wasn't politically insulated. Derek never touched the same thing twice in the same way. Once you see that level of discipline, you realize you're not dealing with impulse. You're dealing with design. I hit my first real wall when I tried to loop in compliance. Not officially, just a casual, hypothetical conversation with someone I knew from a past audit. I laid out a scenario without names, without accusations. There was a pause on the other end of the line. That kind of access chain would be sensitive, she said finally. If it exists. If, I echoed. If, she repeated. And if someone were exploiting it, you'd want documentation so clean it could survive being read out of order. Out of order, as in, she said, without your voice explaining it. That was the warning. If I went any further, I couldn't be the narrator anymore. The facts would have to stand alone. The next day, I noticed Derek watching me for the first time. Not obviously, just a little longer eye contact in the hallway. A casual, "Busy week, huh?" as he passed my desk. He wasn't suspicious yet, but he was curious. That's when I understood something else. I wasn't invisible anymore. Whatever system he'd built, it relied on people staying predictable, staying polite, staying quiet. The moment I changed my pattern, I became noise. I went home that night and made a decision I didn't love but knew I'd stick to. I wasn't going to confront him. I wasn't going to warn anyone. I wasn't going to rush. Instead, I was going to let him do what he'd always done, under conditions he didn't control. Because if Derek really believed he was untouchable, he wouldn't stop. And if he didn't stop, he'd eventually leave proof that didn't require interpretation. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark for a while, listening to the hum of my apartment, feeling the weight of it settle in. This wasn't about catching someone in a lie anymore. It was about making sure the truth didn't need defending. The trigger came sooner than I expected. It started with a calendar update that looked harmless if you didn't know what you were looking at. Facilities had scheduled after-hours testing for one of the legacy access points, the same cluster tied indirectly to the closed room. Routine language, vague scope. The kind of thing nobody questions because it's always been there. But what mattered wasn't the testing. What mattered was the timing. I knew from my own logs that the testing window overlapped perfectly with the hours Derek usually operated in. And I knew, because I'd checked twice, that this time the monitoring rules were different, quietly updated during the last audit cycle. More granular, more persistent. He didn't know that. I didn't touch the system. I didn't adjust a single permission. All I did was document what already existed and make sure the right retention policies were active, something I was explicitly allowed to do as part of my role. No alerts, no flags, just listening. Friday night, the office was mostly empty, a few lights on, a cleaning crew moving floor by floor. I wasn't there physically, but I didn't need to be. I watched timestamps tick forward from my couch, laptop balanced on my knees, the room lit only by the glow of the screen. At 10:17 p.m., the first access registered, not Derek's name. He never used his own credentials. It was the same shared service account as before. Clean authentication, no errors. Then came the physical entry log, same door, same interface, same acknowledgement signal I'd seen from the party night. And this time, he stayed longer. I felt my jaw tighten as the activity unfolded in real time. Configuration reads, permission validations, a minor change, small enough to look accidental, significant enough to reroute accountability if something went wrong next week. He was doing exactly what he'd always done, and for the first time it was all being recorded together. I didn't screenshot, I didn't export anything prematurely. I let the system do what it was designed to do. When the access session ended, I closed my laptop and went to bed without checking again. Saturday was quiet, Sunday too quiet. By Monday morning, the office felt different the moment I walked in. Conversations stopped when certain people approached. Slack messages were more careful, more formal. Derek wasn't at his desk. At 9:42 a.m., a meeting invite appeared on my calendar. Mandatory, small group, HR compliance, infrastructure, no subject line. That was when I knew it had moved beyond me. The meeting room was one of the newer ones. Glass walls, neutral art, a camera in the corner for records. Derek was already there when I arrived, sitting upright, hands folded, expression calm but tight. He nodded at me like nothing had changed. HR started with process. Compliance followed with scope. Infrastructure handled the facts. No one raised their voice. No one accused. They just walked through a timeline. Friday night, access logs, physical entry, correlated system changes, historical pattern. Derek leaned back halfway through, crossing his arms, confidence still intact. "This is a misunderstanding," he said evenly. "That account isn't tied to me." Compliance nodded. "We're aware." Infrastructure slid a printed page across the table, but the physical access is. That's when the room went silent, the heavy kind that presses against your ears. They didn't say caught. They didn't say intent. They said risk. They said unauthorized pattern. They said investigation. Derek looked at me then, really looked, like he was trying to solve a puzzle where one piece suddenly didn't fit. They thought I was gone. I wasn't. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. The meeting ended without a conclusion, which somehow felt worse for him than an immediate firing. His access was suspended pending review. His projects reassigned temporarily. His calendar wiped clean by the end of the day. By Wednesday, people knew, not the details, but the outcome. Derek stopped showing up. His name vanished from org charts. Emails bounced. Someone said legal had gotten involved. Someone else said he'd tried to argue it was all circumstantial. But systems don't argue. They record. On Thursday afternoon, I walked past the closed room. The door was sealed with a new access plate. Fresh screws, bright metal, like it had never been touched before. And for the first time since the party, I felt the tension in my shoulders ease. Because the chaos was over. And what came next wasn't drama. It was consequence. The last update came quietly. No announcement, no all-hands meeting, no carefully worded email about culture or values. Just a short calendar block that appeared and disappeared on my schedule, followed by a system notification I was copied on only because of my role. Access permanently revoked. Case closed. That was it. By the following week, Derek was officially gone. Not on leave. Not transitioning. Gone in the way companies remove things they don't want to acknowledge ever existed. His accounts were archived. His name was scrubbed from documentation. His past approvals were reassigned or revalidated by people who now understood why they were doing it. No one asked me what happened. That surprised me more than anything else. A few people thanked me without saying why. Emily stopped by one afternoon and set a coffee on my desk without a word. Mark from infrastructure gave me a nod in the hallway that carried more meaning than a conversation ever could. But there was no gossip, no whispered play-by-play. Everyone seemed to agree, without discussing it, that this was better left unperformed. Work stabilized fast once he was gone. Deadlines stopped slipping. Blame stopped drifting. Meetings became boring again, which I'd never appreciated until I got it back. The tension that had lived just under the surface for months dissolved so gradually you only noticed it when it was fully gone. A week later, HR closed Emily's file. No follow-up, no asterisk. That was the real win. I ran into Derek exactly once after everything ended. It was outside the building, early evening. He was standing near the curb, phone in his hand, jacket slung over his shoulder like he wasn't sure where to put it anymore. He looked smaller, not broken, just unplugged. Our eyes met. For a second I thought he might say something. Accuse me. Demand an explanation. Try to reframe the story in a way that gave him control again. Instead, he just stared at me, searching my face for something that wasn't there. I didn't hate him. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt finished. So I nodded once and kept walking. That night, I thought about how close I'd come to doing this wrong. How easy it would have been to confront him, to gossip, to act on instinct instead of patience. If I'd done that, he might have slipped away again, or worse, taken someone else down with him on the way out. What stopped him wasn't outrage. It was documentation, timing, and the fact that systems don't care how charming you are. The closed room is still there, by the way. Same hallway, same silence. Most people still don't know what's inside, and they don't need to. The difference now is that it's just a room again, not a weapon. I go to office parties without scanning hallways now. I sleep better. I stopped second-guessing my instincts because I learned something important from all of this. If something feels off, it probably is. You don't have to explode about it. You don't have to save anyone. You just have to pay attention long enough that the truth can stand on its own. And when it does, you don't need revenge. Karma handles the rest.